Segue, to continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue, to make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
To move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue, to perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue, to make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Dr. Kenneth Moffett was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but grew up in Central California. He obtained his bachelor's degree in political science and economics at California State University in Fresno, and his master's and doctorate in political science at the University of Iowa. Today, he's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Welcome to Segue, Dr. Moffett.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dean Romero. Happy to be on here.
Okay, and we're going to talk about hot topic because obviously when we talk about politics, it's always hot one way or the other. So let me start by asking you, why do you become interested in politics?
Well, it goes all the way back to when I was a little kid. For most little kids, they will watch things like, say, Sesame Street, or nowadays things like Barney or cartoons or what have you. I was the kid who was interested in CNN. And wanting to know what was going on in the world. I was also the kid that, when I was 4, I decided I wanted to learn to read the newspaper. Mm-hmm. And the newspaper was taller than I was. So what I'd do, and my mom was very patient about this, every Saturday morning, she'd go grab the newspaper, she'd give me a section of it, I'd get on all fours, and then try to read as much as I could. All right, Mommy, what's that word? And what's that word? And it'd take about 2.5 hours to get through a section of the newspaper, and she was ever patient with my curiosity.
Well, and pay off because you obviously became very interested in the topic.
Yeah.
Yet, you did not become a politician, which is a totally different profession. Why?
Well, basically, I enjoy more studying politicians than necessarily I would being one.
Okay. Now, you have specialized in American institutions, mm-hmm. and particularly on Congress. Mm-hmm. And we were commenting before the show started that Congress has the lowest approval rating of any institution in the U.S. and in its history, for that matter of fact.
Yep.
So let me ask you maybe a tricky question is, what's wrong with Congress?
Oh, gosh. Lots of things. Even, say, speaking as me, the political scientist. One of them is that Congress is not getting done the things that need to get done. So, for example, say, with the budget. We're running now in many of the last several years, Congress either hasn't gotten the budget done on time, or in at least one of them, didn't even get a budget done at all and budgeted entirely by continuing resolution. And the budget's the kind of thing, whether one's a Democrat or a Republican, it's one of those things, has to be done, needs to be done on time. Or otherwise, depending on, say, whether it doesn't get on time, lots of implications come from that. But that's but one example of the kinds of things Congress needs to do that it's not doing.
Now, when one studies political science 101, so to speak, mm-hmm. one of the basic tenets is that for governing, you need to compromise. Mm-hmm. But that seems to be forgotten these days. What's going on?
Well, that's one I've often puzzled about myself, as far as why no compromise and what have you. Part of the answer lies in party polarization, in that if we graph it historically, the Democrats and Republicans, for example, in Congress, or say you even do the comparison between House Republicans and the president, that distance is about as far now as it's ever been in American history. And you have to go all the way back to about the 1890s and right around the time of the Civil War to get something roughly comparable.
And that's what I wanted to ask you, because if historically there was some other period of time in American history where we can find a similar situation of this, I would say, extremism in many cases and distance between different political parties. So it has happened before.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the Civil War. I mean, I don't think that's a very good comparison that we should be making.
Yeah, but the data bear out what the data bear out.
Yeah.
But in the middle of, say, the storm cloud, there is a silver lining. And the silver lining, I guess, is that this country has made it. And it's made it through these periods twice before.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in the 1890s, it took that one about 20 years to fully resolve, till, say, about World War I, but it did eventually resolve.
Okay. Now, some of the blame that have been placed on the deadlock Congress is the way it operates. Would you suggest any particular reforms in the way the U.S. Congress operates in order to better the situation that we're going through now?
Well, there's probably a few different reforms that could be done. I would say one of them is to start doing the nonpartisan items that need to get done anyway. In essence, President Clinton, in dealing with the Republican Congress after '94, that's in essence where he started, was to deal with those items, and then once there's enough traction, then you tackle some of the trickier, more partisan items on the agenda. So I'd say that'd be one. Another one that some political scientists have proposed is, in essence, a variant of what Harry Reid has proposed as far as reforming the filibuster, where Harry Reid's proposed it partially with respect to judicial nominees. But yet there's a few political scientists, and I think of Sarah Bender in particular out at the Brookings Institution and George Washington. What she has proposed, in essence, is a series of sequential steps with filibustering where, in essence, if you think about it like a set of stairs, you stare down to, if you will, having a majoritarian requirement rather than a supermajority.
Now, the filibuster maneuver is not something that has been used in the past in some periods of time, particularly not with this frequency. I mean, because what we have seen in the U.S. Senate is that they are filibustering everything. We even saw an example, if I remember correctly, a few weeks ago, where there was someone who filibustered his own bill.
Yes.
Which I said, explain that to me. I don't get it. What's going on?
The best explanation that I was able to surmise from that one was that person's own bill ended up being amended substantially to where they now opposed the very bill that they ended up initially introducing.
Okay. Now, some people wonder if in democracy we're talking about the rule of the majority. Well, if you have 51 votes against 49, or in the case of a tie, 50 and 50, and then the vice president decides,
right.
Why don't you just go through that process and because that's the rule of the majority?
Well, in short, because the Senate was never totally designed to be a purely majoritarian institution in the same way that the House was. With the Senate was very much set up to be a much more deliberative body and a body that's much more resistant to change. And part of that was the enactment of the filibuster rule. Back in the day, it used to be 2/3 of senators. and it went from 2/3 down to 60.
Okay. But still, my understanding is when that rule was established, nobody envisioned that was going to be used almost with the same frequency that is being used today. It was going to be used only in very special circumstances. Is that correct?
That's for sure. That's for sure.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Now, the other thing that people point blame to in terms of the problems that we have with Congress is gerrymandering. Because basically it is interesting that in terms of number of votes in the past elections, the Democrats for U.S. Congress seats got more votes than the Republicans, vote by vote. But
Right.
because of gerrymandering, the Republicans have a larger majority. So shouldn't be there some reform in that in that area in order to avoid that this disproportion between power and votes?
Well, perhaps so. And some states have done that. So there's about a dozen states, and this number is slowly but surely increased over time, that in essence have gone to some kind of commission. So, for example, in Arizona, it's a set of retired federal judges who draws the districts, and then it's the legislature that can either approve or reject the design of those districts in a straight up or down vote before it goes to the governor. And if the legislature rejects, then it goes back to the commission and the commission redraws.
Does the federal government have any powers to influence that, or to say through the Supreme Court decision or something like that, that gerrymandering is anti-democratic in some specific cases?
Well, the answer is yes, it does. And the Supreme Court has done that to some degree. So, for example, the Supreme Court has ruled that districts can't be used, for example, to discriminate against racial minorities. Another example is that the Supreme Court, in a decision, stated that partisan gerrymandering is technically illegal. However, the one thing the Supreme Court did not do in that same decision was define what constitutes partisan gerrymander.
Okay. Sounds like a very political decision.
Oh, sure. And then we compound it. We go about 15, 20 years after that decision. Then the Supreme Court, in the Texas redistricting case, stated that mid-year redistricting for partisan purposes is legal, provided that, say, the other conditions that the courts have laid down for districts to be designed by, provided all those are met.
But now we just came through a recent decision by the U.S. Supreme Court where they basically said that there were some key provisions of the voting rights that were unconstitutional. And I have heard some discussion among a number of scholars on whether or not that's going to really have a big influence in the final outcome of representation. But I found very interesting that almost the same day that the Supreme Court came up with that decision, a number of states moved to change the voting rules. What's your take of that situation?
Well, and to build upon what you've said, so for example, the state of Texas, shortly after the Supreme Court announced that decision, decided that it was going to go ahead with a voter ID law. Now there's a debate about whether voter ID laws affect turnout, and if so, what kinds of effect they tend to have. Now, over the long haul, I was reading an article in the Washington Post just before coming over here, which stated that the Justice Department is still going to enforce the other provisions with respect to the Voting Rights Act, and is still going to hold states pretty closely accountable with respect to, say, civil rights violations that are otherwise illegal under the Voting Rights Act.
Okay. Well, but I think the whole situation is not as simple as to blame partisan lines, because let me give you the example of Illinois, where we live. We have a governor who is a Democrat, who has a super majority in the legislature, which are all Democrats. And sometimes he comes up with proposals that nobody votes for.
That's right.
Or he vetoes. I mean, so it is hard to understand, because it's not that simple that because there's a party in power, both in the legislature and in the governor's office, that things are going to go smoothly.
That's correct.
So, I mean,
That's right.
What's wrong with this picture?
Well, in short, part of it is that parties aren't as unified as they're commonly portrayed as being. and that there are fissures in the respective political parties that tend to surface, say, either under extremely unified partisan control, like, say, for example, you'd have here in Illinois, or also, say, when a party can't agree on what direction it's going to go, like, say, the National Republican Party now.
Which is, I mean, very fractured in terms of ideology.
Yes, it is.
Yet you see a particular group, mostly the Tea Party types, imposing their will because of the type of people who vote in the primaries.
That's right.
So do we need any reform regarding the primaries to avoid these type of things?
Hard call. And I've often gone back and forth on that, because one thing about enacting reform and enacting rules changes is that oftentimes rules changes tend to have consequences, both intended and also unintended. So, for example, in California, they've in essence done a type of reform where the top 2 vote getters out of a primary, no matter what party they might be, those are the 2 that go on the general election ballot.
Okay.
So sometimes what will happen, and with California, for state-level offices, you have more or less an open primary. So conceivably, you can get a situation where you can get 2 Democrats going up against each other in the general election.
Okay. That's okay. Now, maybe also part of the problem is that the tremendous leeway that states have in setting rules for things that are going to have a national outcome or national influence. So it is interesting because I don't think this happens in any other country where there is such decentralized system of elections and representation. Do you agree with that?
Largely, I would. That election administration historically in the United States has dominantly been left up to the states, save for some federal regulations. And that trend, even through, say, the 1950s and 1960s, while significant, while the federal government has played much more of a role, even there, states still have quite a bit of leeway.
Okay. Well, let's change now of topic. You recently wrote an article about how the Iraq War was a catalyst for political participation. So I was wondering if that is the case. Do you think that when the states are requiring ID for voting and all that kind of things, do you think that can also be a catalyst for people to become more engaged in politics and to say, you are not going to deny my right as an American to vote, no matter what?
That's an interesting empirical question, and I think that'd be one that'd definitely be worth testing, as far as whether say voter ID laws or some other kinds of restrictions do end up affecting patterns of political participation, and if so, do they affect all groups equally?
Because I think there was some evidence in the past presidential elections that when some of those things were trying to be put in place, like in Florida, for example, actually the turnout was huge. And some people have given the opinion that that was because of that reaction. Is you're not going to make, because you're making it more difficult for me to vote, you're not going to imperil my right to vote. Do you agree with that?
I could see that. I could see that happening, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. Now, both Obama campaigns show that his campaign was extremely savvy when it came to the use of social media and targeting audiences for that campaign. In fact, there were many jokes about that while they were using computers, the Republicans were using typewriters and things of that nature. Do you think that this type of social media and new technologies are going to have a major impact in the way elections are going to be decided in the future?
Oh, absolutely. And I'd argue that to some degree they already have. So, for example, with the Obama campaign in particular, in 2008 and in 2012, because of their use of social media and and other online tools, they were able to get a much larger and substantially different donor base than say previous Democratic candidates have had.
He seems to be raising money like an ATM machine. It was unbelievable because it was mostly from small donors.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. $25 or $50 at a time.
Okay.
That's right.
Now, in addition to the social media itself, I think there may be other factors that are influencing the way people are going to vote in the future. We recently saw the case in the Texas legislature when they passed, well, first when they tried to pass these anti-abortion measures with the case of Wendy Davis, who used the local procedure to prevent the anti-abortion bill from passing. Basically standing there like Mr. Smith goes to Washington and you don't stop me. And despite the fact there were very strict rules about what she could do, like not leaning on anything or not going to the restroom, that sort of things.
Right.
Do you think that examples like that in cases where specific legislatures will try to roll over measures that are unpopular are going to serve as an example of more of those tactics and have the national prominence like the Texas case had?
You may well see some of that. And I would argue nationally, to some degree, you saw a case of it a little earlier this year. Rand Paul did a fairly extensive filibuster on things surrounding the Patriot Act. And so with Wendy Davis doing what she did down in Texas, I could see, say, an issue presenting itself in a way to do that. So, for example, I could see a scenario where with the reauthorization of the Patriot Act in 2015, with the revelations surrounding the National Security Administration, where you could see an interesting coalition of liberal, conservative, and libertarian senators, and there being enough of them to where they filibuster a bill for at least a while.
Yet, just recently, the Congress failed to pass more controls over the National Security Agency regarding the kind of data they could gather. And this was, it wasn't along partisan lines.
That's right.
So I found that interesting because also says something about the American psyche and the effect that 9/11 had on American culture.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so I mean, obviously we're dealing with all these other issues that are interesting there. But sometimes, I mean, I get really baffled by things I read. This is a website called dumblaws.com. Have you seen that website?
I've heard of it.
Okay, it's really funny because you find this collection of really absurd laws around there. Like in Hawaii, every family must own a boat. Of course, nobody enforces that. In Florida, pregnant women cannot jump on parachutes on Sundays. I mean, things like of that nature that are laughable. But then there are all these other legislations out there, like the anti-Sharia laws. I mean, the danger of any Sharia law being imposed in this country anywhere is zero.
That's right.
But people seem to be using fear to gain some popularity. And this reminds me of a very famous phrase from Thomas Jefferson, who said that the greatest danger to democracy was an uninformed electorate.
Right.
How are we doing in terms of having the electorate being really informed by the time they go to the ballot boxes?
Well, that's a really hard one because political scientists have found over time that the electorate is never as informed as perhaps many people would like it to be. There's a debate among political scientists about the electorate overall as to whether it's informed enough. And my take on that, if you will, is that there are enough people who are informed enough to be able to make the political decisions, say at the ballot box and what have you. Okay. Are people perfectly informed or as informed as they should be as a group? Maybe, maybe not.
The other thing, of course, is the cost of any political campaign. I mean, we're seeing even local campaigns going to the millions of dollars. And it's mostly because of the cost of television and that kind of media.
That's right.
Some people have argued that by federal law, we the citizens own the airwaves. So why not to tell television stations, like they do in Europe,
Right.
that you need to provide the same time to different parties for free, and then eliminate a little bit the influence of money on partisan politics. What do you think about that?
Well, to require that, in essence, on the one hand, I could see it limiting the influence of money in politics for sure. To give the flip side of it, though, I can also see a scenario where corporations would argue, in effect, that own the media, that, well, it's limiting their free speech, if you will, or limiting their ability to go out and get advertising and what have you as a way to pay the freight, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
To further complicate matters, the Supreme Court,
Citizens United.
through Citizens United, which is the culmination, really, of a series of Supreme Court decisions going back to about the early 1980s that have been slowly but ever so surely edging in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
So as a practical matter, I could see, say either requiring media companies to provide free airtime as a condition of having their media licenses.
Mm-hmm.
As a way of reducing the cost. Also in Europe, another thing they do in some countries is government-financed campaigns.
Yes. Isn't there some financing of campaigns in this country? I heard there's something at some levels, right?
Yes, no, and kind of.
Okay.
Are probably the best answers I can give.
Uh-huh.
Yes, there is the Presidential Election Campaign Fund, which is the checkoff box on the top of everybody's income tax returns, where if you check the box, a certain amount of money goes to the Presidential Election Campaign Fund, from which presidential candidates could draw to ostensibly finance their campaigns.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Professor Ken Moffett of the Department of Political Sciences at Southern University, Edwardsville, for this very interesting, and we could be talking for hours about all these topics, but we run out of time, as we say in this industry. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much, and I wish you the best in your career.
All right,
And next week, we're going to have a panel of experts with whom we will be discussing women's equality issues in the 21st century, with a panel of experts on that particular topic. So you don't want to miss that. So stay tuned.
This has been Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2013.